Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are in the world. I hope you are doing well and thriving. Today, what we are going to be discussing is going to build off of the conversation and the lecture that we had previous to this. In the previous lecture, the focus was really looking at how the American nation starts to really take hold by the securing of land and the defining of borders. And we saw that with the securing of the Louisiana Purchase by Thomas Jefferson, the exploration by Lewis and Clark. We saw the Adams-Oneida Treaty. And we started to see various approaches, particularly ideologies, in terms of the American nation and its position in relation to its neighbors and to other world powers, namely in the Monroe Doctrine, which really solidified under, in the 1830s, this idea that America is no longer open for further colonization, and that the powers that exist on this continent, that's it. There's no more room for, further conflict. Um, the Monroe Doctrine really essentially, places the American position as being, we have no problem with you doing something over there outside of our sphere of influence. But should you decide to involve yourself in what has been termed American affairs or American issues, then you will find yourself involved with us. And that will, of course, lead to conflict. It's also interesting to point out that, that period of securing land really is centered on this idea of purchasing land. That is very characteristic in the, early 19th century. But as we're going to see in this lecture in the 1830s and 1840s, that begins to change. And the reasons for that change from an approach of buying land, land through treaties, to one of more like antagonisms and conflict is really wrapped up in the way that Americans in the 1830s and 1840s are starting to think about themselves as a distinct people. Distinct not just in who they are, but what exactly are their principles, their ideologies, their systems of government, their way of being, essentially, and how that is distinct from their other neighbors, not just in that hemisphere, but also around the world. And so what we'll look at here is we're going to look at how exactly this period, which is about movement. I want to center that this lecture is really going to focus on how we go from that period of securing land, exploring land, defining borders, to now one of movement. Movement of people who are currently in the United States and are moving to other areas to populate it. People who are outside of the United States that are migrating to populate certain areas throughout the country, people who are enslaved in this country and are going to be moving from various regions because of the movements of slavery as more lands open up in the South West. And then also people who are currently in those lands to which migrants, white migrants, are interested in now accessing. So that movement of pushing Native Americans out. And so, as we look at all of this, I really want you to try to consider how exactly this movement of people, the reasons for that movement, the laws, the policies, the approaches, and how exactly these attitudes begin to develop as a consequence of behaviors that are certainly building off of attitudes that had previously been there, that had been passed down generation after generation, but how exactly those who are in positions of leadership and the laws that are passed are really giving people now the freedom in which to act on those negative sentiments that they have about certain groups, and being able to displace them from lands, being able to physically force people from one part of the country to another, to expand the economic and institutional institutional system of slavery, as well as the populating of various areas that are quote unquote, undeveloped in a certain way under a term and a policy that we're gonna discuss known as manifest destiny. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's get started into it. Now, as I had discussed in the previous lecture, I'd mentioned to you the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828. After his previous defeat in 1824 and the corrupt bargain that took place between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, one of the things that's important for you to understand is how exactly the society is changing at this point and how it dramatically changes under Andrew Jackson. So by 1828, when Andrew Jackson is elected, he's elected largely, he's a populist, he's an individual who doesn't necessarily come from the typical prototype characteristics background of what the previous presidents had. So one through six, if you had looked at all of those in terms of characteristics, backgrounds, where exactly they got their education, where they served, the type of work that they did, other than George Washington, which because I don't think that I really mentioned this in that lecture, but in the first lecture about George Washington is that George Washington was not one of those highly educated elites like, the John Adams or, Thomas Jefferson. He was an individual that, he certainly made money and he certainly, was an individual who contributed by fighting in the Virginia militia. He serves in the military. He, eventually, becomes, the general of the armed forces under the American Revolution. But he knows one thing that, that most well, that most leaders should know is that they don't know everything. And the one thing that, as we saw with George Washington, is that he was very keen to surround himself by other people who might have more knowledge than him, that could teach him, that could guide him, that could give him the best information so that he can make the best decisions. Well, Andrew Jackson, also comes from, he came from very humble backgrounds. He grows up on what is essentially the frontier in the 18th century during the American Revolution. He's just a young kid. And he actually works as a messenger in the South Carolina backcountry, really just running around, bringing messages to the revolutionaries to basically track the movements of the British troops. And this is a job that is extremely dangerous. It also requires a huge amount of knowledge and skill to be able to maneuver through the back areas. I'm not sure if any of you have been to South Carolina, but we're not talking about the coast. We're talking about like the inland part. So like not where like Columbia is essentially, but like maybe like 50 miles in from Charleston. Well, that area is pretty much, like woods and swamps and, it's not exactly an easy area to navigate, especially in the middle of the 18th century. They're doing this on foot. And so, his first assignment is really to work against the works of the British. He's actually captured. He is beaten. And he develops a resentment against, the British early on. His family, he's orphaned quite early as a young man. And he, basically, figures out like, well, I'm going to be going, he tries his hand at various jobs, doesn't do too well, but he eventually moves out to what is considered the deep frontier, which is Tennessee, at a time when they were looking for people who really could just help to build these new settlements. And he settles into a profession, he learns the law. And he eventually gets elected to Congress, where he serves as one term. But he realizes that when he gets to Congress, he realizes that these backroom deals, this finagling that goes on, that it's really just not honest work, and at least in his estimations. And so he leaves. He quits. He goes back to, he serves one term. He goes back to his home in Tennessee. And, he actually starts making some wealth. He, in his practice, he's able to buy some land, eventually acquires quite a bit of wealth. And, he eventually is able to amass a reputation to where he later serves in the military. He's a hero under the War of 1812, Battle of New Orleans. And this is what actually propels him into the position of, eventually gets him to the presidency. But it's also because of the changing in the electorate, is that many of the states, which now were regulating who could vote, decided that, the qualifications to vote would largely just be if you're a white male. Women still are unable to vote. Black men largely are completely, unable to access the ballot. And but those former requirements that existed under, like Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, of owning property, that has basically been eliminated. So you have far more common people that are now voting, people that are like Andrew Jackson. They are small farmers, business owners, people who are just trying to eke out an existence. And so this period that, Jackson really ushers in is a fundamental switch in terms of where we eventually start to develop as a country and where we're going to be going in the future is how the participation in, our politics and the process of voting begins to expand. Yes, it is still, focused on white men. So we're still talking about only a, small group of the population. But instead of it being, white elite property owning men, now it's just white men. And then, eventually we see that expansionism going on there. And so, this is one of the things that contributes to it. But when Jackson gets into office, there are a lot of different events that happen under his two terms. What I would suggest is that if you actually take a look at, there is a documentary that's on Canvas. Please take a look at it. It's actually quite enlightening about Andrew Jackson. But, for the purposes of where we're going to be talking about movement and changes and how exactly the nation is starting to take hold in terms of populations developing, growing, moving, one of the first things that we have to talk about Andrew Jackson is that the law that's signed by him and passed by the United States Congress, which is the Indian Removal Act in 1830. This essentially was a move for a power land grab to basically remove any of the Native Americans that were present in the areas of, the nation that white migrants and white people wanted to be able to occupy. That rather than us having these treaties and these agreements, which had largely been the approach, up until 1830, where there was like an opportunity which to engage, to agree, to share, right? That is no longer the case. That Jackson basically comes up with this idea that, what, in order for this country to succeed, we have to access land. And any individual that is on this land, regardless of whether or not they are actually trying to, produce it or contribute to it, if it is not for white men, poor, white men, then it's not being used effectively. And this really is born out of, Jackson's ideology as a young man. This is an individual that, is on the frontier in Tennessee. They're already interacting with Native Americans. He had actually interacted with Native Americans in the Battle of New Orleans. He actually sought the support of Native American groups to fight against the British. He was actually an individual that was looked upon by Native American groups as being a guide because he had suggested to Native American groups, in particular, the Choctaw and the Cree, those that are located in the southwestern part of the United States at the time, to actually adopt American styles of culture, to, adopt methodologies, farming techniques, cities and villages, as well as language, right? Learn English or develop an alphabet, right? And this is what these Native American groups do. They actually try to demonstrate their qualities of being like everybody else, that they want to be able to secure land, develop it, and have that process. Well, that's problematic because once again, what we see in the history of our country, and of course this is in the 1830s, is that the securing of land, as it was in 1763 with the proclamation that effectively ended that movement by, migrant settlers to move past the Appalachians. Here in 1830, it is all about the securing of land for its development and its spread of white individuals. And so if there are people on it, in order for us to be able to secure our place, our rights, our economic viability, because remember those ideas of mercantilism is that there is a limited amount of resources out there and no, we're not interested in sharing because if one person has it and I don't, then they have some sort of advantage or they'll have the ability to be able to outproduce or out money me, right? So we need to be able to secure that land. So in the law that is passed in 1830, this actually established itself in one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of the period, which is known as the Trail of Tears. So let me just play you this little video that actually illustrates what was actually happening as a result of the Indian removal of 1830.
Morning of May 26, 1838, 3 days after the removal deadline, federal troops and state militia began what they called the Assembly of the Cherokee People. Everything that wasn't actually on their illustrious brother, Congress can get back to the business of dealing with us savages.
Goodness gracious, let me go back to what just happened there. Did they just move that? Ay, 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 ay.
Nation with
Nope. Let's go back. What happened here? They just took away my entire video that I was looking for. This is why you gotta love YouTube because it's just so awesome sometimes, right? You have the exact thing that you want to click on, and then all of a sudden, by the way, here we go. We're just gonna remove that and take it away from you. Because why would we want you on the exact area that we had hoped everybody would be in? Okay, there we go. Here we go.
Everything that wasn't actually on the person now belonged to the state. They were forced out into their yards and on into the roads, whatever they had on their back.
we're staging these around the Cherokee Nation with the stockades. And the people were hurried into what were literally cattle dams.
A few weeks after the roundup began, the first detachments of Cherokees were shipped west under military guard. Word quickly got back to the stockades. Drought and summer disease had made the trip a march of death. Chief Ross was frantic to avoid further loss. He convinced U.S. military officials to let him take over the organization and supply of removal, and to let his people sit tight until fall, after the season of disease had passed. A few hundred Cherokees who agreed to renounce tribal citizenship were allowed to remain on their farms in North Carolina. The rest, more than 12,000 captive Cherokees, waited in the fetid stockades. Prisoners, one missionary remembered, were obliged to lie at night on the naked ground, in the open air, exposed to wind and rain. And in this way, many are hastening to a premature grave. Half the infants and all the aged have died directly, and 1/4 of the remainder. Through June, July, August, and September, they waited, until, at the beginning of October, the Cherokee Nation was finally pushed west. It was early December before the final group began the 850-mile trip. By then, the long line of Cherokee travelers stretched from Illinois into Kentucky, unbroken in places for 3 miles. John Ross had seen that the detachments were well supplied for the 3 to 4 month trek. But winter storms made the Mississippi and Ohio rivers impassable, stranding thousands for a full month.
One could have predicted that one of the hardest winters in memory would strike that year. Reached the Mississippi River, the river was frozen. There were 3 different detachments trapped between the Mississippi and another river frozen behind them. And there they sat for weeks in deep, deep snow and ice.
As long as they were moving, and maybe it wasn't so bad, but when you actually had to wait for the ice and sit there, and maybe you're sleeping on snow, but you're probably sleeping on melted mud, and you're sick, your baby's sick, your grandmother's sick, and there's nothing you can do about it.
The harsh weather so slowed progress that supplies of dried corn and salt pork began to run short. When white settlers along the road recognized the Cherokees' need, a few offered help. Others took the opportunity to cash in on the woe, charging wildly inflated prices for grain. Cherokee men were soon too depleted to hunt wild game. A New Englander passing through western Kentucky noted the sad procession. 2,000 people, sick and feeble, many near death. One woman was carrying her youngest child who was dying in her arms. Multitudes go on foot. Even aged females were traveling with heavy burdens attached to their back, on sometimes frozen ground, with no covering for the feet except what nature had given them. The Indians buried 14 or 15 at every stopping place.
Because of the Civilization Project, a great many of those coming on the trail were Christians. And a lot of times on the trail, they would sing Christian hymns. Here are these thousands of people making this forced march, 1/4 of them dying en route. And they're singing, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, guide me, God. Pilgrim that I am in this barren land. I am weak, and you are mighty. Guide us." The United States gained a lot of land and farms and taverns and ferries and things like that. But the loss for the American government is the blemish, the stain it places upon our national honor. What we did in the 1830s to the southeastern Indians, it's ethnic cleansing.
So that's one aspect under President Jackson, where you have what became known as the Trail of Tears, where not just in the staging to move people to the new lands that were basically in the territories of Oklahoma and Kansas, Nebraska, this area, the process of Indian removal happens as a result of and I'll show you this one right here. Basically, what you have is you have Indian removal that is as far northeast as New York, as far as southeast as Florida, and you are moving individuals, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, the Seminoles, the Fox, the Ottawangs, all of these groups are being moved out into this territory here. Now, you heard on that video the reference to, um, the movement of certain people, and there would be like military escorts, there'd be food along the way. Um, but in most instances, these are people that are being marched, to essentially their death. As you could see what was happening with the Cherokee that are being moved out of Georgia. These are individuals, that are being marched through Tennessee and through Kentucky all the way into, present day Oklahoma and Kansas. And they're being marched in the middle of winter. And so while, several thousand die while they're waiting to be marched out in this area, thousands will die along this march. And this is essentially, as the narrator, as one of the historians points out, this is probably one of the first examples of, a, 19th century ethnic cleansing, the forced removal of a group of people so that another group of people can take it over, so that they can, take over this land, take over the resources, move in the systems of government, the systems of economics into these regions. And so, very important to understand, the process. Why can't we go back? There we go. Under this period. Another area that you should understand with Jackson is that it wasn't just the removal of Native Americans, for this opportunity. He actually had other issues under his presidency. One was his mistrust and concern with powerful elements known as like the banking and the finance system, issues in terms of business speculation, but also because of a new organization that is starting to take hold in the 1830s known as the corporation. One of the things that Jackson was highly mistrustful of, as well as despised, was the idea of a centralized bank. He felt that when banks were centralized and there was somehow a connection between, the federal government, the economy, that there was rife opportunity for corruption. And his, concern is that he did not want to, in the case of the bank war that happens in 1832, that he didn't want to renew the charter. One of the problems behind this is that, Jackson wasn't exactly, the most knowledgeable in terms of the banking system and how tied the banking system and the central bank of the United States, they called it the second bank of the United States, was to the economy. And essentially by him, not renewing its charter, what happens in 1832 is that he essentially creates a recession, ultimately an economic depression. Now, of course, the economic depression that happens in the 1830s and the 1840s isn't necessarily one that we would consider like the one that happens in 1929, but this is mainly because the majority of people don't make their money by working for somebody else. Most people make their money off of working the land, right? Most of the country is agrarian. So while there was a financial crisis that did affect the monetary supply and it did affect issues in terms of trade, it didn't necessarily have the crisis elements that would happen later on without much regulation. But what it demonstrated was is that Andrew Jackson was very much an individual who was mistrustful of elites, was mistrustful of, centralized power. He was mistrustful of these aspects in terms of the financial and the economic. What he wasn't mistrustful of was the central powers of the government, namely having a strong and unified union of states. And this takes place in the nullification crisis in 1832 when a system of tariffs, federal tariffs, that were passed by the legislature and agreed to by President Jackson, that the state of South Carolina felt that these tariffs were unconstitutional. And this was the first move that South Carolina made to threaten to secede from the Union. Jackson responds with a very, very similar to how George Washington did under Shays' Rebellion to, use the power of the presidency to make it very clear that the Union has to be preserved and that federal authority will not be countered and that the military could have been used. It wasn't. It was threatened in this case to occupy the state of South Carolina to resolve this crisis. But essentially what happens is that Jackson demonstrates that there is going to be federal supremacy, that the system that we have under the Constitution and the bounding of the states, meaning that there's a federal authority and there's a state authority, and there's a shared system of government in terms of the balance of power and what power is delegated to the federal government and what is delegated to the states, that is not to be questioned. And so this really gets Jackson the associated aspect of being essentially a king. There's some great political cartoons at the time that are produced that show him in a crown and robes, and and that he believed that the government was really just going to be centralized in terms of his authority. And this is also demonstrated in his practice as in being in charge of the executive branch in terms of the spoil system. He decided that rather than have experts, rather than have people who had knowledge of how to run the government, and to run various systems, it was better to appoint people who supported you. Now, if that sounds very similar to, a current president or any of our former presidents, it shouldn't surprise you at all. It is Andrew Jackson that actually starts that. He was also very aggressive. He had a very standoffish attitude. He could be very passionate, but then he could also be extremely demonstrative at the same time. But he should also, we should also recognize that, the form of Jacksonian democracy that that results is really just about having more white men, having a mass-based political parties. He is the founder of the Democratic Party. There was a joke by other political parties about the donkey. Is that their party was represented by as a donkey in these political cartoons. Well, what's interesting is that Andrew Jackson, his campaign team, is that they use this as an asset. And here's the reason why, is that while, they were labeled as donkeys as being like stubborn or unwilling or, being it's something that couldn't be relied on. The donkey, in terms of how it was, the mule or the donkey, how it was viewed in terms of the everyday American, it was seen as something that was extremely needed, useful, and dependable in their everyday lives because it could pull a plow. It was something that you could ride. If you couldn't afford a horse because horses were expensive, you could have a mule. And you could have a donkey, and these were animals that could help you on your farm. They would be able to help pull a wagon. And so Jackson uses this as a way to associate themselves with, yeah, if people want to think about it as a joke, but it's no joke for us because that's the type of people that support us. It's everyday hardworking Americans who believe that, that this is something that is, indelibly tied to our everyday experience. And therefore, Andrew Jackson, who understands this, then they believe that Andrew Jackson understands them. So, during this period, of this Jacksonian era, it's very important to understand the common man ideology. This isn't something that, is hasn't been used by other presidents, particularly like current presidents, where there is often this sense that they need to demonstrate that they're like an ordinary individual, right? That they do things just like everybody else. Um, that Jackson was one of these people that really pointed out that government should be for the people, that that it should be reflective of the people, that it shouldn't be a bunch of elites and it shouldn't be a bunch of people who look down on the people. It should be people that understand the people and want to make better for the people. um which is interesting because this is he certainly did expand opportunities for a whole group of people, but it was white men. But it is that sort of ideas that eventually, will see changes, that are going to happen between the 1820s and 1850s, that sort of ideology of being the common man, that government should be able to help, or it should be something that's reflective of the needs of the people. This is going to be something that's going to eventually make its way into the ideas of other people who are going to ask for further rights, right? Whether that's women's groups, whether that's minority groups. But, to be clear, Andrew Jackson's policies of physical Indian removal, of using the government to, enforce its laws, to be able to push um, back and enforce like the Monroe Doctrine in terms of its ideas that, this is our nation and nobody is going to be able to, tell us what to do or how to do it. This is a period where you really see, that idea of populism and, popular support, really develop, that the president shouldn't be chosen by elites, it should be chosen by the people. And as a result of that, that's really what's going to fundamentally change in terms of causing this westward migration, because of what you have in terms of the attitudes that are beginning to change in the 19 sorry, not the 19, in the 1830s and 1840s. Because once Jackson leaves office, by the time that we get to the 1840s, many thousands of Americans are on the move, right? They are beginning to open up more lands and go in and start to settle these areas. So we're talking about the areas of Oregon, California, and Texas. Now, it should be understood that Texas at the time, as well as California and Oregon and Washington and those areas, parts of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, that is still under the control of Mexico. Okay, that is still part of in terms of Mexican control. Now, the reason why there isn't a lot of Mexican colonialism and Mexican nationals in the areas of like California and in, on the Pacific Northwest is because of what was going on between 1810 and 1821 in Mexico, which was mainly that Mexico was fighting for its independence from Spain. And it takes, 11 years for it to be able to get its independence, but that independence came at a cost. And the main cost is that it was unable to send resources to be able to support areas of development really outside of the certain areas of like Mexico City, Veracruz, areas like that. The areas that, while there's a huge population of Mexican citizens, that come all the way from Washington State all the way down to areas of, Baja California and areas like this. But because the Mexican government was unable to support these areas, they're open to an influx of migration. Now, that is one of the reasons why Texas becomes a destination point for many white Americans that are moving in this area from the older South, which is going to be, Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, to areas of the newer South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Now, Texas is under the control of Mexico, but the reason why Mexico was willing at the time to accept, new migrants is because they needed population. If there's population there, there's people who will pay taxes, there's people that will take over this area. But remember, there are also Mexican nationals that are there too. So it's also a mixture. So they welcomed white Americans to come in. Like there really wasn't a closed border system. There really isn't that sort of sense. But we'll talk about that when we get to the Mexican-American War. But to know that people are moving. One of the reasons, for this movement, that this idea and this spread, it comes out of the ideologies that really were building in the 1820s and 1830s under the presidents of, Polk and Monroe and Jackson, that this idea that what we call American exceptionalism, right? That there is something unique to the American experience, the American experiment, essentially, is that what you look at, and this is a good way to be able to look at it, maybe just in contrast between Mexico and the United States. So, and I'm going to use these terms, in loose ways, but just, try to keep up with me here. When Mexico is founded, meaning that when Spaniards come over and start to take over and they, massacre the Aztecs, they take over, uh, they take over, Tehuacan, Tenochtitlan, right? They take over all of these areas and they kill, Montezuma. They take over the areas. What they're already doing is they are already inheriting an ancient system, right? That's already there because, remember the Aztecs, the Mayas before them, the Olmecs before them, these are societies that have been there for thousands of years, right? And then they are bringing with them Spanish traditions, which is also thousands of years old. So essentially when Mexico was conquered by Spain and then when Mexico emerges, in its own independence, it is essentially a culture that is steeped in ancient local traditions as well as old aristocratic ideologies and systems of government. So essentially, this is an old, traditional way of looking at the world, operating government, everything else. Contrast that with the United States and the way that it is founded, that period of salutary neglect, that period where they had the ability in which to resist, the encroachments and the policies of the British. When the Declaration of Independence is signed and then the Constitution, Convention, and the ratification, America is essentially a modern country, right? It is born modern. It is modern in thought. It's modern in its processes. And this is what gives rise to many people in the 1820s and 1830s to think of American exceptionalism, that they can create a system of government with laws, a republic with, a president, that it is not through inherited wealth, it's not through divine kingship, that they have representatives, that people can start to vote, all white men, right? That these are these distinct differences. And it is these distinct differences that Americans start to see themselves as unique, that there is something about the American experiment that leads to great ingenuity, American development. We bring in people from all over the world, and we somehow are able to take them under this system and create success. That really becomes born in this idea that is coined, and I put this on canvas. But in 1845, there's a gentleman by the name of John Lewis O'Sullivan, and he writes an article, and there is this term that he comes up with after the taking of Texas, which I will talk about later. But let me just read the first paragraph for you. Texas is now ours. Her star and her stripe may already be said to have taken their place in the glorious blazon of our common nationality, and the sweep of our eagle's wings, a wing already includes within its circuit the wide extent of her fair and fertile land. She is no longer to us a mere geographical space, a certain combination of coast, plain, mountain, valley, forest, and stream. She is no longer to us a mere country on the map. She comes within the dear and sacred destination of our country. Other nations have undertaken to intrude themselves in the spirit of hostile interference against us, for our avowed object of thwarting our policy and hampering our power, limiting our greatness, and checking the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. This we have seen done by England, our old rival and enemy, and by France, strangely coupled with her against us. What you see in that paragraph is an ideology that is really pointing out to readers, as well as to how many people felt at the time, that the American experiment is something truly unique, almost as he points out with this idea, providence driven, this idea that it is destined from God, that we are people who seem to be able to multiply, who seem to be so successful, who seem to be able to produce and to exceed expectations. It is our duty to populate these areas. We must go into these regions and populate and settle them. It is our destiny. We must take it, right? Because we are the only people who are capable of doing it. England tried it, but you see where they are now. France, strangely enough. And then because people are looking at, because after Texas has been taken, so the Mexican-American War hasn't started yet, but it's about to in a year. They're already seeing their differences between their neighbors and themselves. That Mexico and America are sort of like estranged cousins. You know, they're born of like the same period, but they're born in very different ways. The experiences are very different. The opportunities are very different. The cultures are very different. And so, you know, it's very interesting. We'll see under this, but you know, when we look at the Mexican-American War, but understand this, that this is the ideology that is going to push people to populate. That no, it's not a question of whether or not we just can remove Native Americans. We should. It's our destiny to take this land. We need to have it. We must have it. Look at what we're able to do. Look at what we've achieved in such a short time. Nobody else has done this before. There must be something special about us. There must be something unique, right? Something that is divine, right? And so when we see that, that's idea of manifest destiny, right? We see that coupled with attitudes that are to provide government support to populate these lands, to allow people the expansion of this continent, that, you know, the advancements and improvements that are happening in this country during this period, whether it is through steam power, you know, in transportation like steamboats, or even, you know, the eventual railroads that will develop, right? We're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about population movement, we're talking about technology, and we're also talking about culture and ideas. And one of the best examples of, you know, one of the consequences, excuse me, let's start with the consequences of this expansion, is that it is the start of the formal annihilation of Native Americans, right? And actual, you know, while there was absolute conflicts between Native Americans and white Europeans as soon as there was arrival, we know that. But now, under the American nation, there are legal ramifications, policies, and power backing them to remove Native Americans from these lands. So this is the first time where we are going to have formal, legalized displacement of Native Americans, and this is going to be the beginning of the destruction and basically annihilation of Native Americans from American culture. The reason why Rick Santorum says, well, there are no Native Americans in our culture. Well, if we want to take a look at one of the reasons why, let's just look to the 1830s and 1840s, because this is where it's going to essentially be formalized as a start. And even with the resistance of Native Americans, you know, in terms of treaties or surrendering of lands, there's going to be conflicts and there's going to be slaughter. There is going to be, the United States military from the 1840s, 1830s, as you see in the Trail of Tears, all the way up until the American Civil War. You're going to see the U.S. military physically remove Native Americans, physically annihilate Native Americans. You're going to see white settlers slaughtering Native Americans on their journeys out west. We're going to see these constant, conflicts, but it is going to be based on not just an ideology in manifest destiny that there is something providential and innate and special and unique, dare I say, better than Native American groups, but then also a legal power backing that will justify those actions and behaviors of annihilation. And this is what is so, powerfully disturbing about this, is that we see how ideas and sentiments over 200 years begin to be placed into physical policies that then result in actionable, behaviors that cost thousands of lives. Okay. So this is the consequence of this westward migration. Now, probably one of the other areas that you should know about in terms of the history of westward migration, if you haven't, take a look at the documentary on the Donner Party. The Donner Party is really just one of those examples of, the type of movement that was happening. This is a group of people. The Donner Party, it actually starts with, two groups. It's the Donner family and the Reed family in Illinois. They make their way to Independence, Missouri, and then they take their trek on the way out to California. Now, what's interesting is as this is happening in 1846, there's thousands of migrants that are moving out. Some of them are new immigrants that have just arrived and are moving out. Some have already, been established. They're maybe second or third generation Americans, and they are deciding to move out further west to bring California, Washington State, Oregon territory, Texas territory into the American sphere. What happens on this journey is essentially this, is that there is a man in the early 1840s. His name is Lansford Hastings, and he writes this book. It's basically just a work of fiction, essentially. It's called The Immigrant's Guide to California. He believed that, we should send more people out to California. He basically claimed in this little guide that I have a newer and faster route. So the old route, which essentially took people up and over past Fort Hall, which you can see right there on that map, and then takes the people up and over the Sierra Nevadas into into the California, into the valleys of California, and then to San Francisco Bay. He basically argued that there was a shorter way to go, that you could go south of the Great Salt Lake and then cross through the Wasatch and then go in through the Great Basin and get into California. So he's writing all this and he's publishing this stuff like in 1842, 1843, and people are reading it. The problem is that Hastings never actually tested it. He never actually had been on it. And when he finally does go on it, he goes on horseback. He doesn't take a wagon. He's not carrying all of his possessions, right? So if you haven't ever been in a wagon and you haven't gone this path and there's no like viable road, you're going to literally have to figure out how to do that. Okay. Now, of course, the immigrants that decide to go on this route, that Lansford Hastings was claiming, it was an absolute disaster. And here's the reason why. Of the 87 members that decide to take this route that goes south, is that the main thing that they had to do is they had to time is everything. Okay. So you couldn't leave, you know, like if you understand the seasons. So like in the Midwest in May, right, we have the spring rains that come through basically April, May. So you couldn't start until May was like until the rain was over. So that's May. You have to get through the mountains by the end of summer. So that's August so that you don't get there caught in the snow so that you can get over into California and then you're good to go, right? Because it's not snowing in the valleys of California, right? So you just got to get over the mountain pass. So basically you have May until roughly about October, okay, to get there. That's that's essentially, you know, what you have to do. Okay, so if you can make basically like 14, 15 miles a day, you're good. You'll be able to make it on time. Problem is that the Donner Party, because they're taking a new route that has never been charted, it's only been made up by Lansford Hastings, they get stuck. And they basically get stuck in an area that we call Immigration Canyon today. And it's basically what is known as the Wasatch, that the Native Americans called it the Wasatch. It's at the time when the migrants are coming through with their wagons, and I mean, remember, we have like you have like 10 or 15 oxen, you know, pulling these wagons that have like stoves and all of their belongings and everything that they have in the world, they're carrying with them. They're being pulled. Well, you can't necessarily pull that stuff easily through a valley. You know, if you don't have a road, you have to make one. You have to essentially hack your way through one. And that's essentially what they did, is that the people on this journey had to hack a road through the trees. I mean, just imagine how long that takes to, you know, cut down these trees so that you can move the wagon party through. And it took them essentially almost a month and a half to get through it. Like, and they're not even close. So, you know, May, June, we're already in July, right? And so then they get to, so then they're already behind. They get to the Great Salt Lake, and I don't know if you guys have ever been to the Salt Lake before, but you know, it's hot and there's no water. So, you know, they basically get there, they try to load up their wagons with as much grass and water as they can so they can feed the cattle, keep the water, and cross it. And they're thinking that they can cross it in maybe like 2 or 3 days. Nothing doing. Here's the reason why. You can walk on the Salt Lake. Like it's all this pristine salt and you can walk on it just fine. But if you're in a wagon, that wagon is going to sink into that sand and to that stuff because basically what happens in the heat of the day, the sand and the salt basically become like sort of like this mush. And so, you know, the wagons basically sank and they got stuck. And so then they'd have to wait until night and then try to push. And then what ends up happening is that they get lost and they're stuck there for basically about a week. They lose like half of their cattle, you know, because they bolt out into the desert because they're basically dying of thirst. You know, half of the immigrants nearly die of thirst as well, and they finally get out. But they had to abandon wagons, they had to abandon everything. So now they're trying to make a rush to get to the mountains, right? Because now they've met up with the old path, but they're already behind. So they're trying to get through the mountains, and then they run into more trouble. They, you know, Native Americans attack some of their cattle and kill them. There's like some of the members can't keep up, and so they're left by the side of the road. Like it just like there's just problems left and right. They finally get to to an area known as Truckee Lake, and this is in Nevada. And I was born and raised in California, so I've actually been to Truckee Lake. You know, I've actually seen the Donner Party Pass. It's actually on, you know, part of the routes if you ever go to any of the national parks. But they're trying to do it, and so literally, like the day before, they start to make their climb up into the mountains, and it starts to snow, and it snows, and it snows, and it snows, and so then they can't find the path. They get stuck. They have to stay the entire winter near Truckee Lake. The winter is so bad. If you see this picture here at the bottom here, you see this man sitting down by the tree. You see where the top of the tree is? That's where members of the Donner Party sawed it off because that's how high the snow was. So they're literally standing on the snow sewing off I mean, so sawing off the top of the tree. Like you see, like right. And so they basically end up starving to death. About 47 people die, as a result. There's evidence of cannibalism that happens. Um, in the mountains. They're eventually rescued by a party in 1847 that comes from Fort Sutter. And it's an absolute disaster. But it's one of the aspects to this idea of the American dream and the American West and this myth of, oh, we're going into the new country with, all of our hope and everything else. Well, this is one of those nightmares that actually happens. And it's important to understand what really the Donner Party is really more of a story of us as Americans and this idea of trying to find the fastest route to get there, a shortcut that in life there's always a shortcut. You know, I think as Americans, we're often looking for the easiest way out. I think that's the reason why, AI has been so popular. It's like, oh, it can give me the answers. Why our cell phones are so simple. It's like, oh, I don't have to remember somebody's number. It'll provide it for me. Oh, I don't have to do that. I can just send a voice text, or I can have Alexa remind me, or I can have this done, right? That there's something about the American experience in mind that comes in this notion of looking for the easiest way out. And in most cases, if we take the Donner Party as an example, the easiest way to get there is not always the shortest route, that it's not the best route, that sometimes you just have to go the longer route or the harder route or do this in order to actually make sure that you actually make it, that it's actually the best outcome for you. Okay. So migration and movement isn't the only thing that is happening going out west. There is actually a movement and a migration by Black people in this country. Um, but that is actually started by another group called the American Colonization Society. And it's founded in 1816. And it was basically a group that was founded in response to the slave revolts that were happening um, throughout the colonies, right? This wasn't uncommon. Slavery is a filthy institution. It's oppressive, it is violent, it is destructive, and therefore it's going to create resistance, and that resistance can come in the form of revolt. And so there were some people in this country who thought that maybe it was best that instead of continuing this system of slavery and continuing this aspect of importing or of moving and expanding slavery, that maybe we stop this and we actually find former slaves, current slaves, free Black people, another place to live. And this is really what comes under the process of the ACS, is that because of the revolution that happens in Haiti, Gabriel's revolution, perhaps we should promote this idea of colonizing, um, recolonizing Africa with Black people. And so basically from 1820 to 1865, there's about 3,700 African Americans that leave Virginia and they migrate to Liberia, the capital that is known as today as Monrovia, named after James Monroe. And it actually grows. There's actually, it turns out to be like nearly like 16,000 American settlers that grow after the Civil War. It was intended, never to be like, let me just make it clear that the American Colonization Society wasn't doing this because it was the right thing to do. Like, they're not trying to say that slavery is wrong and that Black people should be free. It is essentially, this is a tactic to be able to say, we can see the dangers that this system poses to us. Here's a solution. Let's just remove Black people from our hemisphere and send them somewhere else. And best of luck to you. Go ahead and make it. Right now, African Americans see this quite differently. They see it as, well, this is an opportunity for us to, relieve ourselves from discrimination, the opportunity in which to have self-determination, to move. This is an idea that's going to be pushed, that will be considered by Lincoln, in the 1850s and in the early 1860s. There is this sense that while this may be treacherous and that the journey is, going to be difficult, better than the prospects that are here, right? At least from the perspective of some African Americans, and certainly from white Americans who are not interested in trying to share, the abundance that this nation has to offer, right? It's still that mercantile idea. It's still the idea of competition. It's still the notion that, we're not interested in being able to create equals or partners or anything else. Let's just find another place for individuals to go. So, to think about, migration, there's migration in and there's migration out. And this is one of the examples of the migration that is out that takes place in this country. Now, as I've already mentioned, the Native American removal, as a way to free up those lands. The question becomes, what exactly is going to be moving also in this area, in this region? So what we see is that as lands here open up because of Native American removal, white settlers start to move in this area here. And what exactly are they bringing? Well, they're bringing slavery. And so what we want to do is we want to take a look at the expansion of slavery as a result of Native American removal. So let's take a look. We have the census data, and this can give us an idea of how many enslaved people are located in various regions of the territories in each of the census. So in 1790, we have the first census, and remember, slavery is legal everywhere. Okay. And you can actually click on this map and it will show you like the different areas in terms of the counties, how many people are there. So if we go down here to Charleston, South Carolina, you can clearly see the amount of slaves, 50,000, 75% of that population, total free population, 16,000, right? So, free African Americans, less than 2%. Okay. So let's take a look, and you can see down here the different periods for the, the movement of slavery. So we'll take a look, 1790, 1800. Notice the change that already is happening here, all along here in the Mississippi River, out of the Mississippi Territory. 2,000 slaves, 50% of the population. Look at 1810. New Orleans, Mississippi River area. 1820. See these lands still absent because Native Americans are still on it. But by 1830, the removal has already happened. Pushing out, and by 1840, you can see it. So as Native Americans move out, slavery and the system moves in. And what's interesting is that you can see all along here, like if you take a look at these regions, you see 60% is slaves. Warren, Mississippi. 66, let's see, 74% slaves. 78%. 56. I think I just saw an 80 in there somewhere. There you go. Right there. Concordia, Louisiana. 80% slaves. Okay. So interestingly enough, what you can see is that if you also start back here in 1800 and you look at the population in a certain area of Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, right? These areas here, if you notice and you look here and you follow it, each time. So if you look at let's look at Essex, Virginia. So we've got Essex, Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. You look here and you see what it is, 56%. So then let's look at 1830, see what it is then. So we see that it's starting to drop, right? Essex, Virginia, it's dropped down, right? By 1850, see how much it's dropped? interestingly enough, it actually stays pretty steady in certain parts of Essex. But what you start to see is that you see the increase in the movement that's here. Okay. And what's interesting to understand is how exactly slavery, because remember, the importation of slaves has become illegal. Now that doesn't mean that it wasn't still happening, right? We have strong evidence of, uh, of, you know, uh, of schooners, making it through and, being able to, sell slaves that are coming directly. If you take a look at like the Amistad case, that's an example, right? I mean, the importation of slaves was made illegal. The internal trade of slaves is still very much legal. But what we can clearly see here is we can clearly see the movement of slave populations from the old South here to the new South. The extension and the opening up of land as Native Americans move, slavery moves in. Okay. Not small farms, large plantations that are being moved. Okay. So as we look at this, one of the things that we want to try to understand is that as land, open fertile land, becomes available with Native Americans being moved out, slavery as a system begins to take hold in much stronger form and fashion. What I want to be able to emphasize, to you is how the system of slavery lays the foundation for our modern system of capitalism. Now, you're probably asking, well, how exactly, does that work? Okay. So one of the things that we want to try to understand is that the slave system that develops in the areas of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas is one that is predicated on the maximalization of human output. Now, if you understand the system of slavery, right, in terms of its economics, okay, is that you look at it in terms of its system, right? In any sort of economic system, there's four factors that you need, right, to run an economy. You need land, you need labor, you need capital, and you need entrepreneurship. Okay? Four things. The land is there. With the Indian Removal Act and people being pushed out, land is accessible and available. The labor is there. We have slaves that are located in various areas from Maryland all the way through South Carolina. We can begin to move these slaves on out further south, right? So we have the labor and we have documentation, of entire groups, entire plantations being moved by wagon and by slaves being marched in chains, literally through Washington, D.C., on their way to markets in New Orleans. The capital, tools and the resources, right, to help produce that labor. Well, the capital is also the human. It is human capital. The people themselves are going to be the skilled laborers that are going to maximize that output, right, through how much they can actually produce through their physical bodies, right? And we're talking about the main product known as cotton. And then, of course, entrepreneurship, the ideas, right? How do you maximize this? All right. So what I want to do is I want to show you a video. And some of you may know this, may know this video. You may have seen this movie, 12 Years a Slave. It's based on, the actual account of, a slave who was, illegally, basically, he was trapped into slavery, or, kidnapped into slavery. And this system. So the film actually does a quite good job of being pretty historically accurate as to that. But what I want you to do is I want you to listen to this scene and pay particular attention to what the owner as well as his associate, the individual who is going to give him the numbers in terms of how much each of the slaves is picking. Okay.
Bob, got for James. 295 pounds. It's real good, boy. It's real good. 182 for Platt. How much can even an average nigga pick a day? 200 pounds? This nigga ain't even average. 512 pounds for Patsy. 512. Your men folk got no shame letting Patsy outpick you. They ain't yet come. She swung lower than 500 pounds. Queen of the field, she is. 138 pounds. Don't preach. Ain't I with a minute to luxuriate on the work Patsy done? Yes. Lesson wards of righteous living. All be observant to that. All. Outreach. Speak. 138 pounds for Phoebe. Hit 145 yesterday. Pull her out. 206 pounds for George. How much you pick yesterday? 229. Get him out. Come on, get him.
Okay. So what you hear in that video is that you hear numbers being called based on how much each slave is picking in a day. And which notice that the owner, the one who was, lauding about, one of his slaves in particular, that, he is asking the question, what is the average, right? That, a slave can pick in a day. And he's like, he's not even averaging, right? He's not even producing what the average can be, right? And you can see that there is a daily count in terms of how much is being picked. And as you can see, what you see is that when he says like pull him out, right? What did he hit yesterday? What did she do yesterday? What has been her average this week, right? What you are seeing there is that you have a system that is looking at quantitative data and is looking at the averages of what a slave is able to do and produce, what each body can produce. And the incentive that the owner is applying to each of those slaves is a beating, right? A whipping. That's that idea of pulling them out, that they're about to get whipped because they didn't meet that quota, right? That's the incentive, right? In all capitalist systems, there's always an incentive. Your incentive can be to survive, to not get beaten, maybe to get a raise, make more money, right? Whatever. Capitalism as a system is devised on incentivizing, right? The idea that there's something that I can get for this, okay? What we see in the system of American slavery, right, and how it's tied to capitalism is that it is tied to this system of structure and control, right? Now, I'm sorry that this is so blurry, that this is actually from a dissertation research that somebody did back in the 80s. And back then, we were still using typewriters. And so I tried to enhance it as best as possible. But this is essentially what I want you to look at, is that there is a hierarchical system of duties on a plantation, right? What we saw there was three different individuals. We see slaves located here, right? So you would have, as this points out, you have field laborers and then you have skilled laborers. Those are not skilled laborers, right? Skilled laborers are going to be the individuals who are like a carpenter, maybe it's going to be a blacksmith, a masonry. But what we know from the history is that this was not always that distinct, right? Just because you were somebody that maybe cooked or maybe that cleaned or that maybe, fixed the roof didn't mean that you weren't going to be in the field. Okay. So to be clear, the expectation was is that there were duties that everybody was assigned, and that incentive to do the duty correct was based off of a physical, whipping, right? That you wouldn't be whipped if you were to do this. And there could be other incentives. Maybe you get time off, maybe you're not worked as hard, whatever the case may be, right? Under the other system of the plantation system, you have the planter, the owner up at the top. Underneath that individual, you have a manager for the farm. You have somebody who is going to be in charge of basically like patrol. Then you're going to have other people that are going to do general services. Namely, there's going to be like a bookkeeper. There's going to be somebody who's going to keep the data, right? You saw that individual in the video. He was the one who was keeping the tabs on it. But he could have also been like maybe the mill worker. Maybe he's somebody that's just here to help manage what's going on over there. And then also there's going to be people that are overseers that are making sure that the slaves are producing, right? They may be, incentivizing through a moderate whipping or a beating or something like that, that can get those bodies to produce that maximization. This system here, what you see in terms of this organizational structure, is very similar to what we see in corporations and businesses today. That you have an individual who is in charge, the owner. You have people who are like the CFO, the COO, the organizers. You have various managers, people who associate or are in charge of various departments. And each of those individuals incentivize and keep their individuals producing whatever good or service that it may be in order to make sure that there is an overall production. This system of what eventually will become, corporations and large industrial businesses is born in the Mississippi Delta. If you take a look at some of the data, and this is actually from a book, you can actually find this. It's called, The Half Has Never Been Told. It's by a gentleman by the name of Edward Baptiste. He actually he took about 12 years to write this book. But what I want to emphasize to you is how exactly this system starts to work, okay? Our system of American capitalism is based on this idea that you can have an idea, right? The entrepreneur has an idea. I want to be able to build something, a factory. I have a product that I want to produce, right? I have something that I want to be able to get people to support me in, right? Okay. So if I am somebody that wants to start a business, I have to have some capital, some money. I need to get people to either give me that money, right, as an investor, or I have to have it myself. And I can use that to buy the labor, to buy land, to buy all the other resources. Well, how exactly would I be able to get more capital, right? And let's take a look at the system of slavery. If we take the numbers that each of those that slave owner was doing, and we have documentation of literally hundreds of plantations where they're having massive amount of bookkeeping. That bookkeeping, those records that are done for a season, they can then use that information and produce that and bring that to a bank to say, this is what I'm able to do with each of my slaves. Each of my slaves is able to produce 300 pounds of cotton. Each season, I am able to produce this many with this many slaves. If I can get an additional 20 slaves, I will be able to produce this much. Would you like to invest in that? And what we see in the 1820s and 1830s is banking and investment houses that are developing not in New York City or in Boston, right? But are actually being founded in the Mississippi Delta. The richest people on the eve of the Civil War were not in New York. They weren't in Philadelphia. They were in the South. The most millionaires, the planter class, the people that we would consider the top 1%, those people were located throughout Texas, all the way up through Georgia. They're in the South. And it is because of this system. What plantations effectively found out is that if we can keep quantitative data that records the actual ability in which to measure production and to figure out a way to incentivize to meet that production, then we can use those numbers as a way to get others to invest in our companies, essentially our plantations, invest in additional labor so that I am able to produce more and more. This is one of the reasons why, if you take a look at this data here, is that you can see not only just the increases in the amount of slaves that come from various states, whether it's from Virginia, Maryland, DC, North Carolina, South Carolina, and moving to places like Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana. But what you also see is you also see the incredible improvement in terms of production in terms of what is actually being produced. The amount of cotton that is produced in 1810 compared to what it was by the eve of the Civil War in 1860 is that you are looking at a marked improvement, almost a tripling. Okay, let me read you a section from Baptiste's book. The expanding cotton plantations of America's southwestern region allowed the textile industries to escape Malthusian constraints, and not just by adding additional acres and laborers. Consider this. The total gain in productivity per picker from 1800 to 1860 was almost 400%. And from 1819 to 1860, the increase in the efficiency of workers who tended spinning machines in Manchester cotton mills was about 400%. So that means that the machines in Manchester, England, the machines in Boston, the machines in Philadelphia and New York that are spinning that raw cotton that are coming from the South, the people, the physical laborers are producing at the same speed and rate that a machine is. A human being is producing at an equal rate as that of a machine. So how exactly is that being done? Through that incentivization of violence. Therefore, okay, so meanwhile, the efficiency of workers in weaving mills improved by 600 to 1,000%. Therefore, even as textile factories harnessed increasingly complex machinery to more powerful non-human energy sources, even moving from water to steam power, cotton pickers produced gains in productivity similar to those of cotton factories. And those gains created a huge pie from which many other people around the world took a slice. Lower real cotton prices passed on gains in the form of capital reinvestment in more efficient factory equipment, higher wages for new industrial working class, the revenue for factory owners, enslavers, and governments. Cheaper cotton meant cheaper cloth and clothing. Thus, productivity gains in cotton fields also translated into benefits for consumers of cloth. Most of the world eventually acquired clothes made in the industrial West from cotton picked in the US South. American capitalism is built on the system of quantitative measurement through incentivized violence under the system of slavery. The reason why American slavery is unique, it's not just because it was legally tied to issues of race. It is because it also created an economic productivity system that allowed for investments for other organizations and industries to develop as a consequence of its productivity. Our system of American enterprise and American capitalism can only happen as a result of American slavery. It's not just that the labor was free. That certainly is a big part of it. But it is the fact that labor was tied to a scientific system of production. Okay? Now, of course, in such a discussion as I'm saying, does this remove the human degradation and oppression and complete and utter annihilation of an entire group? Absolutely, because this is just an economic point of view. But when somebody says to you that, oh, slavery, Was it really that efficient of a system? Was it really something that contributed to American, enterprise and American industry? The answer is absolutely yes. It is because of the labor of slaves and the ability to produce equally to that of a machine that further industries were able to develop, that further investment and opportunities were able to develop that would further expand American investment and capitalism. Slavery is the foundational element of our system. Does it eventually go out? Sure. But make no mistake, its contribution is key, because without it, it would not have allowed for further investment and development in areas that we somehow think, oh, well, isn't that just the natural way of things? No, it's not. Because if slavery is already matching the capacity of a machine, if physical human beings are already matching the capacity of a machine, that provides an opportunity to develop further systems of productivity that can further enhance and expand investment, right? It's exactly what it says right here. Lower real cotton prices passed on gains in the form of capital reinvestment in more efficient factory equipment. The only reason that cotton fell in terms of its cheapness is because of the massive productivity of slaves. Without that ability to have those gains passed on to further reinvestment, American capitalism would have never taken off the way that it did. So, yes, slavery was and is the cornerstone of American capitalism. It's not too much to say or to dilute to simply say like, oh, well, it was just a part and we had a very complex system. No, it's something that was relied on and provided opportunity for others, to create that expansion. Okay. So of course, the system of slavery and its because of not just what you can see in popular culture, but what you can read in texts, what you can read in primary source accounts, is that slavery is based on a system of violence. It is a system of oppression. It is a system of destruction. And so, of course, this is what is going to lead to various rebellions, which is one of the reasons why the American Colonization Society was founded. But take a look at some of those rebellions. Probably the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831 is one of the more well-known. But there are individuals, as we will see, that see the expansion of slavery as a threat to free to free settlers and to small farms. Okay, that when you have a plantation of 250 slaves, right, the ability for you to compete as a small farmer is practically impossible, right? And so what we also see during the 1830s and 1840s is this continual process of trying to balance power in terms of slave state and free state. And we will see some more of those conflicts that happen as more territories open up, and there is a question of whether or not they become free or slave. But this is also the period when abolition movements, especially in the 1830s, as I said, with like the Amistad case, become more prominent. More and more people are starting to question, like maybe, the system of slavery shouldn't be expanded, not on any moral grounds, but just really on the fact that, that slavery just isn't a system that we need to be having expanded, that we should be trying to contain it where it is. There are people that, of course, are going to be advocating for the abolition of it. But there's also going to be a great deal, many people who are like, look, I may be, I may find the institution of slavery, deplorable, but I'm not interested in having an African American as my equal, right? So this is going to be the position of many people who are going to just say like, well, as long as it stays over there and it doesn't continue over here and allows me an economic, viable chance to be successful, then that's fine. So really it's always boiling down to, opportunities of economics that really is guiding people in terms of, whether or not slavery is going to expand and continue. It's not on any real moral grounds. Um, Finally, um, because what we will talk about in the next lecture is going to be the Mexican-American War, is that I want you to think about how the issues in Texas, namely the independence of Texas that is declared in because of the revolution. So remember how I had mentioned that the Mexican government first welcomes white settlers? Well, by the early 1830s, they want to stop to this. And they basically, because Mexico is losing control of various territories in its country because of people that are having problems with the central government in Mexico City, Texas being one of those areas. But Texas was also spurred on by people like Sam Houston, who really, create this sense that, that's built up in this manifest destiny idea that, that Texas should be free and should not be under the control of, Mexico. It should be part and should have the right to be able to declare itself a part of the United States. In 1836, it does that with the Texas Revolution. And, there is a revolution that happens. You've heard of the Alamo, where, there is a loss. General de Santa Anna comes down there and, annihilates the revolutionaries, many of them, migrants from the United States. But eventually what this does is this allows that attitude that begins to change in the 1830s into the 1840s to be able to say like, well, rather than us asking to annex Texas and to purchase it, let's just take it. And this is where we're going to see that attitude happen in the next lecture. But essentially the Declaration for the Independence of Texas is really centered and modeled after the Declaration of Independence. But the concern is that if Texas joins, is it going to be, a slave state or a free state? Most likely it would be, slave because of the expansion of cotton into Texas. And what eventually happens is that the Texas has a vote to, after it declares its independence, to accept statehood and to join the United States. And this is one of going to be the contributing factors that's going to cause for the Mexican-American War that's going to happen in 1846. Okay, but we will talk more about that in the next lecture. If you have any questions for me on this one, please feel free to reach out. Okay.